Hello and welcome to our webinar with Dr. Ann Maglia of the University of Massachusetts Lowell. It is titled Reviewing Plans for Campus Reentry and Pandemic-Related Challenges. In this webinar, we will learn several ways that UMass Lowell used InfoReady Review to manage through the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes managing internal research grants to investigate COVID-19, routing and approval of plans to reenter research facilities, and then ultimately routing and approval for campus-wide reentry into the university. The latter used the power of InfoReady Review's collaborative decision-making capabilities at the highest levels of the university. So, join us now as our webinar is about to begin.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Carlos Mancata, Director of Services here at InfoReady. Thanks for taking the time to join us for today's Peer Spotlight webinar. Our guest panelist today is Dr. Ann Maglia from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, or UMass Lowell, as their logo shows. Ann is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, Administration, and Integrity there. And she has quite a good story to tell today about the ways that UMass Lowell used InfoReady Review for a variety of COVID-19 processes. So the theme of the webinar today is reviewing plans for campus reentry and pandemic-related challenges. So some of the topics Anne's going to cover are one, grants related to COVID-19, and then second one is lab reentry for urgent research, and then department and unit campus reentry. So these are three strategic goals of the university. And the first goal is a more traditional way of using InfoReady Review, while the second and third are focused more on form collection and approval process, which now that so many people are working remotely, it becomes even more necessary to have an automated way to do that. Now, before turning things over to Ann, we do have some logistics to cover. The webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes today, so about 20 minutes for the presentation and 30 minutes or so for Q&A with Dr. Maglia. All the phones are muted. If you muted those who use their computer audio. If you're on a phone and called in separately, you may want to mute yourself there as well. Since everyone is muted, please use the Q&A option to submit any questions you may have for Ann. And for those of you who would like a link to a recording of the webinar for yourselves or for colleagues, that an edited version is going to be available next week. There's a link on screen for the webinar. We also have a couple poll questions. You may have already seen the first poll question launched. And then lastly, there's a post-webinar survey that's going to load afterwards. It'll just load in your browser. Now that we've covered the logistics, I'll turn it over to our panelist, Dr. Ann Maglia. Ann, show is all yours.
Great, thank you, Carlos. So I'd like to thank Carlos and Amanda for having me do this. I was just saying before this that it was a really good exercise for me to do as a reflection over the last 7 months or so. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about just the processes that we used and how InfoReady helped facilitate those processes while we were going through what most of us have been doing on our campuses. So you start with the next slide. So first, just to give you some context. So UMass Lowell is about 30 miles north of Boston. It's a campus of about 1,800 students, about 1,100 faculty, and we're in an urban setting. And Lowell, the city, has had a number of spikes in COVID cases. So in addition to having to manage, just as most of us have, the interaction between folks in Lowell as well as our students with COVID, Lowell is also known for being a textiles area. Originally, it was one of the textiles mills in Massachusetts, and so the university itself, much of the research is involved in things like additive manufacturing and textiles. And so one of the things that we also wanted to do as part of what we do at the campus is to see if we could mobilize some of our expertise to help in responding to the COVID pandemic. So that's sort of where we are at the outset. So next slide, please. As with most of us, I just wanted to give a sort of an overview timeline of, as what we were all facing, just as other universities are. We're facing the same thing, that the governor gave an order in sort of the middle of March that said, okay, we're going to shut down our campuses. And we had about a week to turn all of our classes to remote classes, have the students leave the dorms, close down all of the buildings. And that was about 3 days to get all of our labs shut down, and then maintain animals and cell cultures and equipment, et cetera. In middle to late April, we started opening little by little. We started trying to open some of our labs. Eventually, by the middle of May, it was our core research facilities and more of our labs for urgent research. And by the time we got into the middle of June, we started slowly opening our labs again, with the anticipation of opening up in the fall for about 25% of our students in our classes. Unfortunately, in July, we had another spike, and we went back. Our plans were kind of reduced, and so we had about 700 students and about 25 classes on campus in the fall. And now we're starting again to try to look into the spring, and can we, increase the number of students on campus and number of classes, with the anticipation that we may have to come back down. Next slide. So what I really want to talk about is, in the course of all of that activity, how we used InfoReady to review to help facilitate some of these activities and strategic, both strategic plans for research as well as strategic plans for the campus itself throughout the course of the process. And these are the things that I'll talk about, but everything there that's not blue are things that we used InfoReady review for, but I'm just going to talk about a couple of these. Next slide, please. So one of the more typical and ubiquitous uses for InfoReady review, as many of us know, is for internal grants. And we had launched our internal seed grant competition. Those proposals came in just about the first week of March, right before we then found out that we had to close down. And so we hadn't started reviewing them yet, and we decided that we were going to pivot and use our internal seed funds for COVID-related research, in part because we did feel that there were folks on campus that could make an immediate difference in the pandemic, but also to leverage some of the opportunities that were being presented, especially by the federal government, in terms of COVID-related funds. So in terms of considerations for that quick pivot, what we really wanted to be able to do is launch that competition immediately, make sure that it was easy for the researchers to understand what it is that we wanted, give them a clear rubric for so that they both knew what we were evaluating, and also so that our reviewers could quickly evaluate. And then finally, we wanted to be able to get that money out and access to labs if necessary is immediately. And we were able to do that all essentially in 10 days. And so next slide. And what we were really calling for the first one is, what we were trying to do here is basically take folks that had research that could be quickly pivoted, so that they could take a project and be able to, with very little transition, be able to turn it around and make it responsive for COVID. And we funded 3 proposals out of that, and all 3 of those proposals have Some of them now have published results. Two of them have submitted larger grants quickly after this. But we recognized that, so we got like 13 proposals. Most of those 13 we felt would not have an immediate impact. So we kept the competition going with a different flavor after those 10 days. So let me skip back here. Go to the next slide. First, I want to tell you about what we were looking for. So here's the rubric. We were looking for, will we have an immediate improvement in public health? Will we have a viable solution, something that could actually be acted upon? How important is it to get them access to the labs and be immediate? So our review team, as well as the proposers, knew pretty much what we were going for. That being said, we felt like only 3 of them really stepped up, really met those criteria. So we started a second competition, which is the next slide. And that was more leveraging partnerships. And what we were doing here is then we had over a course of 2 additional months, we had 2 rounds of additional funding for those that may not have an immediate impact, but will have either, for lack of a better word, taking advantage of the situation of the data and the pandemic, or could have a long-term impact. So something that maybe perhaps could be a diagnostic test, but it may take them, a year before it could go from development to market, something like that, versus something that could be immediately used. So for that, that second round, we ended up funding another 12 grants that are working on that, on COVID. And so we have 15 total, and a number of those have partnerships outside of our university. And they range anywhere from social science and the impact of bullying and social justice issues, all the way to using gold for treatment of as an antiviral for PPE, or for treatment of as a vaccine. Next slide. So that was kind of the typical use, and I think the take-home message there was that having a system in existence that we were using, we could very quickly turn that around into something where we could immediately pivot and use the money for something different. So that was certainly great for us to be able to do. But we also wanted to start putting folks back into the lab. So we had a small group of people in the labs consistently from the time that we shut down, largely just as maintenance, a few people that were doing COVID-related research or DoD-related research, but most of our buildings were entirely shut down. We recognized starting in about May that, okay, we really need to get folks back into the labs. And while some of the federal agencies were still being very generous in terms of allowing us to continue spending money, some of our industry partners were not as generous, and we're expecting some results. So we launched, for lack of a better word, we launched a InfoReady review competition, where what we were doing is taking information from our researchers for urgent access, critical and urgent access to the research. And by urgent, what we really meant is you've got to make some progress on this work. And that progress can be, that urgency can be demonstrated by a number of different ways. And we really wanted to do this instead of prioritizing research. We didn't want to have to prioritize one person's research over another. We wanted the PIs to make the case for why urgency was important for their research program. We also had safety training that we required everyone to go through. This is COVID-related safety training that was developed on our campus by our New England Consortium training group that does safety training. We also wanted to make sure that our researchers, all researchers that were going back on campus, acknowledged that we had a set of campus guidelines, and so that we could clearly, if someone was not following the guidelines, we could point to the fact that they acknowledged and they took responsibility for following those. And finally, one of the big things is that we wanted to make sure that we had the largest group of stakeholders that we could have involved in the decision-making process. And so in addition to having the research AVC and the deans, we also had to have card access, campus police, housekeeping, facilities management, environment, health, and safety involved. As we had to reopen the buildings for these labs, we had to turn hoods back on, turn on or at least, up the HVAC systems, and make sure that housekeeping was available, determine which bathrooms had to be opened, et cetera, et cetera. So next slide. I think what is just a general good practice for us, and that had helped a lot, was that we did publish the rubric that we were using for our review process, and I think that helped our researchers get a better sense of specifically what it was that we were looking for, and I think it made it faster for us to be able to give feedback to our reviewers or to the researchers that perhaps did not get access approved immediately. We could go back and say, okay, these are the reasons why you just haven't demonstrated that, and we just need this resubmit. So that certainly was very helpful to make sure that we used a very clear rubric. Next slide. And this is just a screenshot of the form that we originally used. And you can see that some of the questions here are really questions that like EHS or facilities management were asking for, as well as campus health and wellness. So it was very much it was a team of 6 folks, all from different parts of campus, that were doing the evaluation for reentry. Next slide. And again, this is just to show that we did have this acknowledgments that they couldn't submit the application unless they acknowledged that they had read the safety guidelines and that they agreed to abide by those, and that if they did not comply, that they could result in loss of access. This becomes very important for us down the road when we have potentially issues of non-compliance. So it was very helpful that this was something that InfoReady Review had available. Next slide. After about a month of keeping the competition focused on urgency, we started to relax the restrictions for who could be on campus. Our overall goal was to make sure that we had no more than 25% occupancy in any lab, floor, or building, and this was part of the governor's guidelines. And so we recognized that as we first started out with the urgency, we were quite low on our occupancy, and so we knew that we could start adding in a little bit more here and there. And so we started to allow for localized scheduling in the labs. And so if a PI could come up with a plan to make sure that their lab would maintain that 25% occupancy or less, we allowed them to do the scheduling for that instead of having that done centrally. And very similar process. We basically took the same competition, same folks were still looking at it, but we did something slightly different. Next slide. And instead of using flip back on. You just see that again we published the rubric, and the only thing that's really changed is the applicants providing a plan consistent with phase 3 priorities, maximizing social distance, minimizing the number of people in the lab. So it's really very similar to what we did. It's just that we changed the criteria. Next slide. And here, instead of using the forms directly in InfoReady, we actually started to collect a little bit more information, and we switched over to using a fillable PDF form. And then they would upload and submit the PDF form through InfoReady. So we're still using it for review. We're just the mechanism by which we are collecting the information is a little bit different. The one thing that using this system allowed us to do is to track individuals and the time that each individual was that were set for being in the lab. So the fact that we had university card access and police on our team meant that we knew exactly, we were granting access by card, by room, by individual, by shift. And those shifts started out as a morning shift and an afternoon shift, so we could permit them access only for a period of time. And we were tracking some in 2 or 3 of our more busy buildings. We were tracking that access to make sure that that access was consistent with what we had down. So if you go to the next slide. And we actually tracked all of that using a spreadsheet online. And here's a Gantt chart version of it, where you can see that we were tracking individuals, what room those individuals were in, what times they were able to be in there. And we even have, so you can see the green means all day long, blue means just afternoons. And this was because the spreadsheet was online and everybody on the team had access to it. When environmental health and safety or campus security or police were in the building, they had access on their phone. And so they could look in a room and say, this Perry 304, I should only have 2 people in that room right now. And these are the people that should be in that room. And so they were able to, as part of our non-compliance with research control maintenance, they were actually know exactly who should be where, when. And so that allowed us to do a very close tracking as we were starting to ramp back up just as research to know who is where and were they following the rules. Next slide. We were also tracked non-compliance. We had environmental health and safety and campus police doing monitoring. And so somewhere between 200 and 400 inspections, lab inspections per week as they were walking through the buildings. Eventually we got about 500. Right now we have about 580 people that are doing research on campus, but we started out with roughly about 100 to 150. And as more people got on campus, obviously they did more walkthroughs. And so you can see that everyone also had an idea of what was happening in terms of compliance. Next slide. This also allowed us to do weekly evaluations of how things were going on campus. And this is just a kind of a snapshot of overall access. So how many people you can see on the right-hand side on the top. This is when we first started out. We were adding access in slowly, and we were doing it either in morning or afternoon shifts. And we were adding building by building, little by little, giving facilities some time to open up those buildings, giving them the opportunity to environmental health and safety opportunity to make sure that we could get masks distributed and that we could get cleaning kits distributed. And then as we got more and more open, we started giving full day access. And now we're at a point where we have more people with access to buildings than the 25% capacity, but those are all being managed at the local level, so that we still know that we have no more than one person per 200 square feet in a lab at this given time. And as of today, we've still had no cases on campus that relate to researchers or anyone conducting research. And so we feel fairly confident that this strategy has worked pretty well for us for research. It minimized the burden on our EHS and housekeeping and facilities team as much as we could, while also allowing for access to the researchers so that we have a pretty robust research and no cases. Next slide. Another couple of things that we did is, as faculty needed access to offices to build, especially buildings that were closed, we started some dean direct, basically dean's office direct competitions. So if you look at the 5 competitions at the bottom there, the last 3, we have the College of Education, that's Fine Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences, and the College of Engineering. Those are their direct requests. So if somebody wants to go in and just grab a couple books at their office. while the buildings are still closed, they can get card access just for the day to go into their office. The other thing that we did is, because of the successes of the research, as we were starting to ramp up for the fall, we decided to use InfoReady Review to review the plans for opening up the campus for student-facing activities. So next slide. So we were specifically thinking about those things like advising and residence halls and food service and all of those activities that would require people to be on campus but still maintain less than 25% occupancy for any given office. One thing that became apparent to us is, as we had to shut down in the spring and then again shut down in the fall, like most campuses, there is definitely a loss of revenue by not having the dorms open. There's also a loss of revenue by not having our hotel open and not having our conference center and our arena open. And as a result, that means that, you know, as much as we could save on even just, you know, housekeeping and keeping buildings closed, that is going to be an overall fiscal savings for us to try to keep as much closed as possible while still allowing the research enterprise and the academic enterprise to continue in a way that is safe and that we can still engage the students that are on campus, which this fall we had about 700 students, giving them an enriched opportunity while they're on campus. So that meant that, again, we really needed a large stakeholder team so that everyone's opinions could be taken into account, so we could balance what is the best number of buildings and buildings that we could open, while also making sure that we can continue doing the research, we continue having the classrooms open, and that we're maintaining that under 25%. And that we are also allowing those student-facing roles to have people on campus. So we included the deans, we also included executive cabinet. So it was quite a campus-wide endeavor to get these open, and that was all using InfoReady Review. So go to the next slide. And you can see that, you know, we go anywhere from human resources to ROTC to the hockey team asking for their plan to get back to campus. And that was approved both by the supervisor and then by an executive cabinet member. And so right now we have our operation set, and for the spring we're just essentially, depending upon how many students we're anticipating, increasing the number of students in the spring, but we may not be able to do that, and so we may still have to stay where we are as we're all in that exact same place. But we know that we'll be using InfoReady Review to either adjust our current plans or maybe to relax the plans based on what things look like in the spring. Next slide. And so I kind of wanted to bring this back a little bit and just say that we have a lot of lessons learned from this, from the overall experience. And I think that some of the biggest ones are, we need to be open to embracing change. So in addition to pivoting our Sea Grant program to COVID related, and that I think that change was a really strong one, and put us in a good position to leverage a lot of opportunities as well as do some good. But we also recognize that for some uses, for example, a PDF form was actually better for us. And so to be able to pretty nimbly go from filling out, having a within the competition form that's filled out, to having a PDF that gets uploaded and still using the competition, I think also helped us, and it helped some of the researchers that were doing the submitting. One of the things that we learned in both positive from positive experiences and a few negative experiences was that transparency and communication was really critical. I think for the research aspects, we did really well in terms of communicating the rubrics and the expectations and what the rationales were for the decisions we were making. We were very open about those. Once we started adding a larger group on campus, I think we were less transparent about who gets to be on campus and when and why. And it definitely caused some consternation. And so being able to then come back and have to kind of explain how the decisions were made, I think we could have done a better job at providing a rubric for the overall campus access. And I think that's really important. And the other thing that I think was really critical here, and I think we have built a lot of really good relationships, is by having an extremely broad stakeholder group. So having everybody on campus that I would not have normally thought about working with, the university card access or the chief of police or housekeeping services when it came to putting researchers back into the research labs. But the fact that we did that, I think, really made for an extremely smooth transition, and also provided a lot of really good relationship building for us. And as a result, it also makes us feel pretty confident that we can use something like InfoReady Review for lots of other things on campus, because it's really just a way of communicating among people and capturing information. And I think that was really demonstrated through this activity. And I think with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Anne, for sharing all of that great information about your operations and processes. The response to COVID-19 is ongoing, so I'm sure everyone is trying to think of different ways of improving or streamlining what they're doing on campus right now. As Anne mentioned, she's ready for Q&A, and she's also graciously shared her contact info on screen here as well. So she's ready for Q&A. I'm ready for Q&A. Let's jump into these questions. So Anne, can you discuss any ways that your rubric or expectations addressed equity and inclusion among research teams?
So that is a great question. One of the things that we did in the original urgency, so part of urgency was things like pre-tenure or students that needed to finish degree. So for that, so there's two things. One, that we were taking into account that we wanted to make sure that we were providing access to almost anyone that had it, as long as they could demonstrate that there was urgency. And we tried to make that urgency very a broad definition of urgency. And then the second thing was that we had a broad and diverse review team as well. And so our reviewers, also what I didn't tell you is that on the review team were also the associate deans from all of the colleges. And so part of that too was to make sure that we didn't minimize needs from any individual on campus.
Thanks, Anne. If anyone has follow-up questions to that, just type that in and we'll return to it after going on to the next question. So the next question, how do you provide feedback to people if their plans aren't quite correct? Is it a hard no, or do you try to provide them some individualized advice? Also, have you said no to anyone?
Great question. So for research, the only time we said no is for long-term access, meaning ongoing full access when a building could not be opened. And the only reason a building could not be opened is because that would, let's say that was the only person that wanted to be in that building, in which case we worked to try to find them an alternate space to work in. So there really was never a no, it was always a let's just adjust this so we understand more, or let's find an alternate way to make this happen. So we haven't gotten to know. The only, I would say, let me take that back. The only no that we had said was we had a pause on human subject research. And we are now finally to the point where we are allowing human subject research. But from the very beginning, we did not allow non-campus participants to come onto campus. And so there was a pause on those. So it was our only no.
Thanks, Anne. And a follow-up to that, how were student groups and organizations handled in terms of their activities and requests?
So most student groups for the fall were virtual. There were very few, at least at the beginning of the fall, student groups that were allowed to participate on campus, partly because the campus itself was by and large closed. As we have gotten later into the fall, there has been some relaxation of some of that. For example, there's music, there's a few things that have been happening. People have been able to, like band has been able to practice, not necessarily together, but parts of that have been together. And so by and large, though, most of the campus activities have been either virtual or very limited for students.
Thanks. Here's another question for you, different topic. How do you anticipate this process evolving as your university's response towards COVID changes? Will you keep this process implemented, simplify, or move to a different process entirely?
Very good question. Definitely depends on what happens with COVID. I would say for now, we will continue with this process. Our anticipation for the spring is, again, no more than 25% occupancy in any of the offices. And so we are essentially using the same process. We have the same emergency operations committee and essentially the same type of rubric and process. As we go into the summer, that is a good question. We don't know. I would say, though, that our process has definitely evolved from the beginning in terms of a extremely centralized controlled to a more decentralized process, and with more monitoring rather than initial control up front. And so I think that we are in a kind of a sweet spot, at least right now, where there's enough local oversight that and less centralized control. And I think that seems to be working pretty well right now.
Thanks, Anne. Here's a somewhat non-COVID related question. Do you use InfoReady Review for all internal funding solicitations? And do you use it for anything else that's not related to COVID?
Yes, we do. We use it for both the centralized internal seed grants. We use it for college seed grants. We use it for soliciting abstracts for symposia. We have used it for poster sessions. We use it for a lot.
Yep. Thanks. Switch it up a little bit there. Going back to COVID, as you continue to need to provide updates, maybe in response to the surge, Do you have any tips for combating email fatigue?
Mm.
People may not be reading important information as often as they should.
Yeah, that's, in fact, we were just having a conversation this week about just general fatigue, between email fatigue and compliance fatigue. One thing that we have found is helpful is if someone from our executive cabinet does a town hall specifically targeted to whatever the particular functional group is, about once a month, once every 3 weeks. And so in this case, we have a vice chancellor for research and innovation will give a town hall on Friday. And then we have follow-up postings of notifications that go both on the website and also go out as email notifications. And then we follow up with like a research newsletter that goes to everyone. And so we're trying to use the same message 3 or 4 different ways. And then we also do the direct email to those researchers who are specifically in the labs, and we use a particular email address that is only used for that. And so the hope is that when they see that particular email address, they know that this is something that has to do specifically with either changes to or updates to research access. So that's kind of what our strategy has been. I'm not sure it's any more successful than anyone else's strategy, to be honest.
Working with universities all over the world, the question of email fatigue and people not reading instructions or all the information comes up all the time. It's unanimous, basically. Yeah. Always a struggle. We have a few more questions here. What strategies are you providing to faculty to help them balance their teaching, personal life, and research obligations?
That is such a great question. So in general on our campus, we have a number of programs that really are about work-life balance, specifically focused on the effects of COVID. One of the things, for example, that we did is we automatically added a year to the tenure clock. I mean, so that's a basic one that was, I think, helpful. Specifically in the research group, we have done a number of things. For example, we have a monthly seminar series / writing group that specifically focuses, like a writing retreat that specifically focuses on personal balance of, how do we manage this during this time. We've had several roundtable discussions, both for graduate students and for faculty, about managing workload and expectations during COVID. And then even some of the grants that we funded as part of our seed grants were specifically focused on things like the impact of COVID on both students in the student learning environment, as well as individuals who are battling COVID and managing that as a community. So I do feel like that's one thing our campus has been really great at, has been taking into account that this is not an easy time for anyone, and that the expectations of what can be accomplished have to be tempered with the realities of our reality right now.
Yeah, a little bit of empathy goes a long way right now, I think.
Really does. And it's the same with the staff too. I mean, we're even the staff in my group, I think we have the exact same. We're trying to, for example, in research administration, we've been trying to shut down the office once every 8 weeks for a couple of days, just to give them a break. And of course, we have to manage, proposals going out the door, and don't want to add additional stress to the researchers who are trying to get their proposals out. But we also recognize that our staff are working triple time and that this is a very stressful time for them. So being able to just give them a couple of days of, not answering the phone or not answering emails and just being able to get caught up, I think actually goes a long way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Need a break. Need to clear your head. So we, you spoke quite a bit about InfoReady review used as a tool in your processes. But aside from form collection and workflow software, what types of other tools did you use, such as project management software?
Yeah, I think for us, so we have an internal system that we are now putting our data into, which is a GIS system that was built in-house, where I didn't show it, but by the spring, we will have all of these data fully integrated with that so that we know on every floor, in every building, are there researchers there? Are there faculty in their offices? Are there classrooms that are being used? And it lights up like red, yellow, green, so we know what the kind of how many people we have and what the densities are. And that helps our facilities management team think about, if we've got a 4-floor building and we've got researchers largely on the 1st and 4th floor, that means that, we can think about how do we do housekeeping or how do we do HVAC systems, and be able to be most efficient in the way that we, clean and disinfect and use the HVAC system. So that software has been really amazing how they've been using that. We haven't really done a lot with that from the research side. What we've done from our side really is using that smart sheet which is just any online spreadsheet. That has been really helpful for us to be able to at least initially track individuals and know exactly how many people were in each building at a time to make sure that we were under the 25% occupancy. So we know what the square footage is for each lab, and we were making sure that we stayed under the the number of people that would be in that lab that would be 25% occupancy. So I think the Gantt charts were a really nice way of looking at just a quick scan of who should be in a building, when, and where. That was nice.
And so related to that, you've collected information in InfoReady. So the data is there, and then you're getting it to the smart sheets.
Yeah.
How was that? How did you go about that? How was the experience of extracting the data?
I would like to say that it was easier than it was. A lot of that was putting it in by hand. It was, some of it was cut and paste. It wasn't automatic. Once we had the PDFs, it was a little bit easier, which is part of the reason we switched over that, because we could actually export the data in a little bit easier way. We could get reports, and it wasn't bad with some cutting and pasting, but putting it in the spreadsheet was a little bit of a labor intensive, to be honest. Yeah.
I'm going to pick your brain on that a little bit.
Sure.
Later offline.
Yeah, and it may be that there are things that I don't know about that we could have done, but yeah, that was a little bit of a heavy lift.
I'll definitely be getting your feedback then.
Good.
So here's a question about implementation. Mm-hmm. Did you need to use InfoReady support to implement these COVID reentry competitions?
I don't think so. I have been one of the administrators, and I've been pretty familiar. I've been using it for 4 years, and so almost everything that we did, I think I did in my, in the evenings or watching TV. And so it really wasn't too much of a heavy lift for implementing. I think one of the interesting things that we figured out was, which, this is probably actually a pretty easy one, is that if you have somebody who is a reviewer and they log in to submit something, they don't know where to go. And so little by little, we figured out, and it was helpful for people to just say, yeah, this is how to fix that. So, but we didn't really need support to help us specifically set up the competitions or implement them. No, I think they were pretty straightforward.
And one thing, just for the group online, is that competition templates can be shared within your institution and with other institutions using the system. So if you have questions about that, let us know at InfoReady.
And absolutely, I'm happy to share anything that anyone wants. If we can get it to you, you can have it.
Thanks, Anne.
Absolutely.
A few more questions here on the list that we got. So this is a big question. So how and why did the university decide to use InfoReady Review for the department and unit reentry? That's kind of outside of normal types of processes, and that requires a bunch of big conversations. You said there's stakeholders all over the institution, so that required a lot of people at the table to decide.
So I'll tell you, we had some, when we originally knew that we were going to shut down, the provost rolled up 5 different basically emergency teams to develop plans for the fall. We had no real intention that we were even, for the summer and the fall, but largely for what are we going to do when we have to go back in the fall. The team that was rolled up for the summer and the fall was the research team, and we really had to be in immediately, well before students and the academic units. So we jumped right in to trying to get folks access, especially those that needed emergency access for managing animals or resetting servers or managing cell cultures or doing COVID related work. So we came up with the processes, we came up with the implementation, we came up with the review team and the rubrics and did all that. And that team, that committee had representatives from across campus, because we knew we were going to need all of those people's input into developing plans for reopening those buildings for research. So when it came time to then open up departments and units, we already had a process that was working. We already had a group of people that were familiar with InfoReady. We already had a competition that was working. And so it really, it was kind of like, why don't we just use this? And it worked great. So yeah, so there was really no discussion, to be honest, for that, why to use it for the departments and the administrative units.
It's part why reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Well, glad that part was easy.
Yeah, it was. And I do think that was one of the lessons learned is if you've got something that's working, especially when you have to hurry up and do something, just don't, why reinvent the wheel? Exactly.
Now, so, there's these on-camp, you spoke about partnerships, both with collaborating on campus, but you also spoke about the external partnerships with corporate sponsors, maybe nonprofits, etc. Could you tell us a little bit more about the efforts that did you redouble your efforts into making those, expanding those and making those work?
So this was definitely a challenge, because we did have to shut down a lot of the access to our campus. So for example, we have a core research facility that we have a lot of industry partners and external users, and we had to shut that down as one of the first things that we had to do. And so we almost had to say to our partners, you can't come on campus anymore. You can't be part of the campus. And that was definitely a concern and a challenge. But we were able to open the core research facility really is one of the first things that we open back up, especially our nanofabrication lab, which is, it's a clean room. So, it's one of the safest places you're going to be. And so that definitely helped that we were able to, re-engage our partners without too much time going by. But one of the things it did is, for example, we had another university that we were partnering with some seed grants. And unfortunately, as soon as this hit, we all kind of pivoted and decided not to do that. So it did prevent us from doing some of the partnerships. But by saying, okay, well, these COVID related things are going to be, some of them specifically are going to be about partnerships, and we're looking for external partners. It allowed us to then look for other partnerships. For example, there's a med school in our system, and so a lot of our we developed new relationships with the med school as part of COVID. So I would say that it was kind of a mixed bag of on the one hand, not losing partnerships, but certainly not having as close a relationship because of it. On the other hand, forging new partnerships.
It's every aspect has been affected.
Yep.
So we're running short on time, so there's one last question here. In terms of collecting follow-up information from the people submitting these forms and applications, are you planning to use the progress reporting functionality in InfoReady Review, or are you planning on collecting information on outcomes at all?
So that's a great question. In terms of research outcomes, not as it's directly for the COVID grants. Yes, we'd use the reporting outcomes, the project reporting outcomes in InfoReady for that, for sure. For those that have gotten back into the labs to do the research, nothing more than what we normally do in terms of expenditures and publications and research. So we are tracking, for example, what are our quarterly expenditures for research money this year versus last year, and how does that relate to the number of people that are in the labs? We do that. But we're not using InfoReady to track just overall productivity of those that have been able to get back into the labs, but not as part of the seed grant program. One thing I will say that I didn't mention is that we also did a Qualtrics survey, and that we do weekly asks of how's it going, basically, and are there, any things that you would improve or change, or are there, how are people following the compliance rules, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have, over the course of the 24 weeks we've been open, we have about 550-ish responses to the Qualtrics survey, which are anonymous and could be duplicate individuals if things have changed over time, certainly. As a progress report on how things have been going. And then when the research evaluation team meets weekly to look at those reports I showed you, we also go over the anonymous survey results to see if there's anything that we could improve, or if there are things that we should address. And those evaluation teams include the police and environmental health and safety and housekeeping and campus wellness, et cetera. So that, I think, has been again a nice way for everyone to be involved in the process and being transparent in how things have been going. So we are doing monitoring in a number of different ways.
Great. And a quick follow-up question to that. How does someone update their approved personnel if, say, a student graduates or a new postdoc is hired?
So that's a good question. It depends on what it is. If it's a new person that we are adding, because we require them to attest to having completed the training, we do require them to put in a new InfoReady request for that individual. If it's a matter of just changing the rooms that an individual wants access to, or changing the day, now it's not less so, but if they want, let's say, weekend access, they can just send us an email. There's a dedicated email address that they can provide, and we can do approval that way. But because we want that attestation, we do require all new people to be put through InfoReady.
Awesome, thanks. And we've reached the end of our hour together. So we close on a good question. That's bound to happen because everything can be chaotic in some way or another right now. The InfoReady contact info is on screen. There's a few different pieces of information there. If you want to know more about using InfoReady, review, contact my colleague Max Dinerman. If you want to talk more about functionality in your license, contact me. Or if you have a technical question, contact the support team. And with that, with that, thanks so much to our special guest panelist, Dr. Ann Maglia. You were wonderful. Important information at a unique time. Have a good week, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving and stay safe. Bye.